All right, welcome to week 3 of the semester. This week we are dealing with federalism, and this is a chapter, and this typically is the point where people really do start struggling. The history surrounding the United States and our Constitution is not so hard. There's a lot of it, but it's not really that hard to really grasp. When we get to the next chapter, chapter 4, I actually commit 2 weeks to that because there is a lot of stuff, a lot of legal, Supreme Court decisions and amendments that you have to take some time with. Federalism is hard. It's hard on the one hand because a lot of Americans don't really understand it. And part of the reason why students struggle to understand federalism is that, first of all, it's an evolving relationship. The relationship doesn't always hold, that relationship between the federal government and the state governments, and then the relationship between and among the federal, state, and local governments, that kind of interconnection of relationships is very complex. And we've gone through these very distinct periods, and there's a lot of conflict. A lot of our conflicts really that exist between Republicans and Democrats really boil down to how they interpret federalism. And I'll talk in a minute about how our flawed COVID response is directly related to that sense of how we view that relationship. But again, on the one hand, we've gone through these periods, certainly for much of our early history, really up until the Civil War, and then really into the opening decades of the 20th century. We had this idea of dual federalism, where the federal government exists at one level, the state governments exist at another level, and they really don't interact with one another. And what really began happening, beginning with the Progressive era and much more aggressively with the New Deal, is that the federal government began intruding and kind of poking along at the relationship between the federal government and state governments, typically using money to get the states to do things that that they wanted to do anyway. Building roads, building hospitals. These are things that states wanted to do. Having more money for building schools. These are things that the states often wanted to do but lacked the resources to do. And one thing that really begins in the 1960s is the relationship begins to become more adversarial. So where previously in the New Deal, the federal government was really just saying, you really want to do this, and here's some money so you can do it. Subsequently, the federal government starts saying, really with regard to civil rights, but also with environmental regulation, you need to do other things. And we're not always going to give you the money to do it, and we're going to punish you if you don't do it. And that's where you begin getting these ideas of creative federalism, where the federal government, especially when Democrats were in charge, were pushing these civil rights claims to guarantee equality for all Americans. And that's something that especially in the South was very controversial, and it actually it encouraged a massive electoral realignment where millions of Southerners who had previously been Democrats moved into the Republican Party. And likewise, the idea of environmental regulation and regulatory policy, the rise of the administrative state, these are things that Republicans don't like. In some senses, it's because many Republicans want to return to that idea of dual federalism. And the question is whether dual federalism is really a sustainable way to govern in the 21st century. And when you look at our COVID response, first of all, it amounted to what I call fend for yourself federalism, where the federal government really didn't do enough to coordinate a national response, and the states oftentimes found themselves compelled to formulate their own responses, and all too often electoral politics and economic considerations predominated over what should have been a public health matter. And so without adequate guidance from the federal government, you've got a very uncoordinated and fragmented response to the coronavirus pandemic. And that has made things a lot worse. I think, probably, it's doubled the number of fatalities we're ultimately going to suffer. We've passed 400,000 fatality or 300,000 fatalities at this point. We will almost certainly reach 500,000 before we're able to get enough vaccines in people's arms. And again, part of the problem there is that there was really no coordination between the federal government and the private sector, which is making the vaccines, and the state governments that have to actually get the vaccines distributed in a rational and reasonable way. And again, instead of some coordinated response, you've had each state saying, Florida saying, it's packed full of old people. Well, we're just going to give the shots to old people. And some people saying, well, let's give the shots first to first responders. Here in Oklahoma, again, we have both a supply and a demand problem on the one hand, because it's very difficult for us to get access to the vaccines. And secondly, we have a large percentage of our population that thinks that the coronavirus is fake news, and so they're not interested in taking a vaccine. So, it really is problematical, and and it really illustrates the challenges that we confront. And when I teach, I actually teach a class just on federalism, and I think I can't stress enough just how important it is for students to have a realistic, understanding of how that relationship between and among the federal government and the state governments and local governments, and how, when it's coordinated and when it's collaborative, good governance is far more likely to happen. But when they're at loggerheads and when they're stalemating one another, it really does contribute to ineffective government. And right now we need effective government, because I'm fearful that the alternative is going to be something like the kind of ongoing violence that we saw this past January 6th. So, if you have any questions about this chapter, obviously the forum is the best place to bring those challenges and that difficulty that you might have understanding. And like I said, I teach an entire class just on this subject, so I can help you if you'll let me. So anyway, let's have a great week of discussion.